This story would start by showing us a person who would be suffering. Eventually, they would turn into a zombie and begin attacking people, infecting them, and creating an unstoppable zombie plague. Over time, safe places would diminish as the number of zombies increased. The government would try to shelter people by building a wall. However, there was a problem. Housing prices skyrocketed due to the influx of refugees into the city. Rent prices significantly increased, leaving many people without housing options, forcing them to go out and face the zombies. Here we are introduced to the protagonist, King Chulso, a worker who, like most people, had nowhere to live. He worked daily, sleeping only 2.5 hours, and earned 4.5 million guns. However, he couldn't afford to buy a house for a long time. He calculated that if he kept working without spending a penny, it would take him 731 years to afford a house. His only option was to join the territory recovery movement, where they could earn 5 million for killing a zombie and providing evidence. After that, we would see the protagonist introducing himself and withdrawing 120 million wounds from his emergency reserve, which he would use to buy things that would help him survive. Determined to give his all in this last chance, he would not realize that he would bump into a girl, causing her to fall and drop some arrows. Another person would quickly pick them up and take them from the girl. Yet another person would grab her by the hair while taking her crossbow, reproaching her for not being able to protect even her weapons. The protagonist would intervene and release the person's wrist, claiming that he was hurting a person, not a zombie. The girl would thank him, but the protagonist would tell her that she didn't have to thank him and mention that he could use a long-range weapon since he couldn't afford to buy one due to its high price. Seeing the other person with the arrows, the protagonist would quickly take them and board the train. Inside the train, a frightened guard would inquire about the noise. The guard next to him would tell him not to worry, as they were just from the recovery movement and were probably being used to decrease the population. Once on the train, they would venture outside the wall without knowing what to do. At that moment, a loud sound would start coming from a loudspeaker, attracting the attention of the zombies. Everyone would cover their ears and see the train starting to close. Terrified by the situation, they would try to get back on the train without success, as it would separate from them. People would be overwhelmed by the horde of zombies surrounding them. The calm protagonist would lend his crossbow to the girl and tell her they had to kill 7,900 zombies that same day. Armed with a shovel, he would relentlessly confront the zombies. Despite his efforts, a zombie would grab him and crash him against a part of the train. The girl would be scared witnessing this, but the protagonist, on the verge of losing consciousness, would get up and take hold of the shovel. He would kick all the zombies and attack them one by one without resting. The next day, the girl would get off the train and observe the protagonist sitting on a pile of corpses. She would ask if he is okay, but the protagonist would only ask her to be quiet and start counting all the zombies he had killed since they needed the money. The girl would ask how he planned to claim all that money, to which the protagonist would simply say that he just wanted a house with a garden, if possible. At that moment, they would notice someone watching them, the guards of the 3rd Infrastructure and Transportation Team. One person would ask about the number of zombies he had killed, and the other would reply that he could only count 8,000. The protagonist had achieved his dream in a single night. Sometime later, guards would be guarding the wall and notice approaching zombies. One guard would ask his companion how many there are, and he would say 1, then correct himself and say there were 2. His companion would hit him and scold him for not being able to count. Upon seeing the zombies, they would be surprised to see that they were carrying luggage. The guard would request permission to shoot, but they would notice that the zombies were gesturing and shouting for them not to shoot since they were people. After the previous events, we would see the protagonist with some businessmen who would tell him that he had killed a total of 8,021 zombies. Since each zombie was worth 5 million, he had earned a total of 400 billion ones. While the protagonist looked at the money, the businessman would ask him to keep all the information confidential, as it was classified. The businessmen would discuss how they didn't have that much money to pay him in that way. It was necessary to give it to him, because if they failed to pay him, he could cut off their noses, just like the zombies. At the same time, he would tell them that they would recover it anyway. The protagonist would leave the building with the girl, and then open a briefcase and give her 30 million won for the crossbow, telling her not to follow him. The protagonist would quickly leave the place. Buying a house with a small yard would thus achieve his goal. but the story would be too boring if it just ended like that. Black blood, the protagonist would wonder, remembering that before leaving the building, they told him to leave his nose there since it could be a health threat. The protagonist would quickly start turning into a zombie, but at that moment, he would remember his past when he was with his brother, telling him that even though their parents separated along the way, he believed they were still alive. So with that in mind, he would say that he would buy a house with a yard to put a plaque with his family name, and be reunited. The businessman who spoke with the protagonist would be outside the house, along with a group of policemen and agents. The businessman, with a loudspeaker, would shout the protagonist's name, thinking that since he was a survivor, the slayers would try to recruit him. But according to the zombie prevention law, they could kill the protagonist. And thanks to another law, which stated that the assets of the infected would be confiscated, they could keep everything. The protagonist would leave his house, remembering everything he did, and would start screaming that he only wanted to have a home and that not even the whole world would snatch away his dream. Everyone, frightened, would see the protagonist lunging towards them. We would then move to Hyundai Aqua City, where we would see a girl bathing. But her secretary would inform her that her client had already arrived, to which she, asking him to wait, would leave the bathroom, thanking him for the wait. The girl was Chloe Aeon, the director of Slayer Company. Chloe would ask him why he needed her, to which the client would say that since her company focused on recovering territory, objects, and more, he planned to request her services. Chloe's secretary would show the prices to the client, who would be surprised by how expensive they were. He would apologize while saying that he only had 100 million. Angry, Chloe would ask her secretary why she wasted her time with a beggar, to which the client would stop her and tell her that the object was worth more than 50 billion, explaining that before the apocalypse happened, he decided to invest just for fun, and now those coins multiplied by millions. If he brings them, he will transfer a portion of the profits to her. Chloe, upon hearing that, would quickly change her mind and understand the situation. The client, realizing that everything was too expensive, would ask if there was something cheaper, to which Chloe would say she had a rookie. Thus, as he left the place, we would return to the protagonist, who, in tears, would ask why him. As we were explained, there was only one rule circulating among soldiers and politicians after the wall was created, and that was not to corner people, as even a rat, when cornered, loses its mind. The protagonist would lunge at them, knocking down a guard who attacked him. The protagonist, remembering he was infected, would bite the guard's neck. Everyone, astonished by what he had just done, would try to separate him from the guard. In doing so, they would manage to make him step back. But the guard would start agonizing, thinking he had intentionally infected him, and since he would fully turn into a zombie in 3 minutes, they would start cornering him. The protagonist, getting up, would say that nobody could take him out of that place because it was his home. A person on the verge of becoming a zombie fighting until the end was precisely the problem. They had cornered a monster that annihilated 8,000 zombies. We would then see the backyard of the protagonist's house, which would be filled with corpses and zombies. The businessman would think that it was just one person and couldn't understand why the plan had failed so miserably. At this point, we would notice a person on top of a car, looking at the massacre caused by our protagonist. The businessman would ask who he was, and this person, pulling out his lawnmower, we would see that he was a slayer named Sanso. The businessman would think he was saved, while telling him that he was the leader of the third team and would ask him to save him. Sanso's older sister would tell him it was curious that even zombies can talk nowadays. After those words, her brother would start his lawnmower and quickly finish off the businessman. All the zombies, attracted by the noise of the lawnmower, would lunge towards him but be cut like butter. After finishing the mowing, he would ask what they should do with the owner, while saying that his vision was blurred and he was about to turn into a zombie. He would ask if they should knock him out and cut off his head, to which his sister, telling him to wait, would think that he had been repressing his transformation to the point of defeating all his opponents, which meant he had extraordinary mental strength. While thinking that she could take advantage of him, she would lunge at him while telling her brother that if he touched him, she would cut his salary. Chloe would tell the protagonist that she could hear her, and she would ask him if he wanted to live. The protagonist, saying that she didn't see that he was turning into a zombie, Chloe would explain that the specialized service for zombie control, or more commonly known as slayers, are people who have passed the first stage. And since they are such exceptional individuals, the military, companies, politicians, among others, try to hire them in order to recover territory. And if they successfully recover it, they receive a bonus. The protagonist, saying that she wasn't listening to him, would say that he was a zombie. Chloe, taking out a syringe, would tell him that it was the cure, but she would only give it to him if he decides to work as a slave and pay for it. Chloe would ask him if he wanted to live, even if he became someone else's dog. "Do you want to live?" Chloe would ask him, to which the protagonist, trying to say that he wanted to live, would spit out blood. Sansa would snatch the antidote from Chloe, while saying that in the world, who would want to die by injecting themselves? Chloe, who would collapse to the ground, would say that it would be alone. Sansa would respond that the matter would be closed. Chloe would argue, saying that the antidote she had given him was worth 500 billion guns, and that even though a person's life is more important, they were talking about 500 billion just by common sense. Sansa would answer yes. After all, they were just slaves to money, while thinking that in any case the protagonist would also be a bastard. But that was better than dying. After the protagonist fainted, we would see him waking up scared as he looked around. Someone would tell him that he had finally woken up, and the confused protagonist would ask who they were and where he was. The person would reply that he was in a taxi and would ask if he remembered anything. The protagonist, trying to remember what had happened, would think that he went hunting zombies, and that after that, he would buy a house. He would quickly remember that he had been infected. The protagonist, examining his body, would see a screen in front of him, realizing that he was not infected. He would be surprised to find that he hadn't completely lost his memory, and would ask if he remembered the woman with silver hair. The protagonist would recall that she was the girl with the gas mask. The person would instruct him to touch the screen as he had a video for him, and he would need to answer some questions since he had to focus on driving and couldn't explain it at that moment. Dodging all the zombies, the person would make the protagonist press the screen. Suddenly, Chloe would appear on the screen and introduce herself. The confused protagonist would continue watching the video. Chloe would explain that a slayer refers to specialized services for eliminating zombies, and they are the ones who reclaim territory, recover resources, rescue survivors, and kill specific targets. Chloe would inform him that he was now part of that industry, meaning he now worked as a slayer. The confused and angry protagonist would question why it had to be him, to which Chloe would respond that if he wondered why he had to work in something he didn't want to, it was simple. He owed a huge debt. The bewildered protagonist would inquire about the debt, and an angry Chloe would accuse him of pretending not to understand, revealing that the cure that saved him was created by a suspicious company. It was later discovered that the cure was effective, and now it was valued at 500 billion won. Chloe would explain that until he paid it all back with interest, he would be her slayer and slave, reproaching him for saying that he would survive even if he became someone else's dog. The protagonist would be left speechless and ask who the driver was. The driver would tell the protagonist to start working, to which the protagonist, stating that he didn't know what they were planning but he was leaving, would ask him to stop the car. I would tell him that he had to stop anyway. The protagonist would look out the window, and Choi would tell him that his mission was to go through that path and reach the center of Guion to retrieve a hard drive. Meanwhile, Choi would give him a collapsible shovel and a radio, instructing him to call when he finished the mission. I would tell him that if he wanted to return to Busan, he had to do what he knew best. The protagonist would exit the car with his new suit and look at all the zombies while remembering the reason he entered the walls of Busan. It was because he hated zombies, but he left because he hated poverty even more. But now, driven by debt, he had once again ventured outside the wall in a ridiculous situation. We switched to Chloe, who would receive a call from Choi, who would express his annoyance but quickly analyze the situation and agree to do the job. Chloe would thank him and promise to give him a check for the travel expenses, while reminding him not to forget the drone footage. Her secretary would ask if the protagonist would do what they wanted, to which Chloe would reply that he would do well since he had a natural hound's instinct. The protagonist, seeing the zombies rushing toward him, would start complaining about the situation, while Chloe would comment that she didn't believe he could pay back 500 billion won by selling food on the street. We return to the protagonist, who would quickly charge at the zombies jumping on top of them. But one zombie would grab his leg, and he would quickly stomp on it, using it to move through the zombies. The protagonist would push, slice, and crush the zombies, eliminating them all. At this point, we would see a drone capturing everything. Chloe, who was watching the protagonist, would be amazed at how he dealt with the zombies and would quickly tell Chui not to forget to record it for a movie, while toasting to the upcoming success of the film. In that moment, the protagonist would only think that it was ridiculous to take advantage of someone while they were unconscious, just to put them in debt. At first glance, it seemed like the protagonist had accepted reality and had started to pay back. But he wasn't angry. The only thing he could do at that moment was vent his frustrations on the zombies in his path, while thinking that he couldn't repay 500 billion won, and if he did, he would be a slave for the rest of his life. He would also say that he just had to find her, eliminate her, and get rid of the loan. But the problem was that he didn't know how to get back to Busan. As he pulled out his radio, he would recall Choi's words while looking at the note indicating the location of the hard drive. The protagonist would say it's better to finish it as quickly as possible. Now in front of the building, he would enter, while Chui, who was controlling the drone, would stop recording, thinking that there are many guys like the protagonist, but the boss has a good eye for finding monsters. Suddenly, something would fall in front of Choi's car window. He would quickly take out his axe, realizing that it was just a piece of meat. Choi would step out of the car, and upon seeing the meat, he would notice the clean cuts, realizing that it couldn't have been done by a zombie. Looking up, he would see a person on top of a house. I wouldn't notice that there was a cell phone with an alarm inside the meat. Following this, the alarm would start ringing, and all the zombies, attracted by the noise, would rush towards Choi. Meanwhile, we would return to the protagonist, who would already be on the floor where the hard drive was located, wondering which of all those computer parts was the hard drive, while complaining that the apocalypse happened before he could attend his computer class. In reality, the protagonist had dropped out of school in elementary. 30 minutes would pass, and we would see that the protagonist was worried because he didn't know what a hard drive looked like. So he grabbed as many parts as he could carry and declared that he wouldn't let Chloe get away with it. He called for pickup, but there was no response because the person in charge had been devoured by the zombies, who were approaching Choi's car to listen to the protagonist on the radio. They thought it was a rescue mission. As they prepared another meat alarm, they revealed that the protagonist's name was Park, a former slayer who became a zombie hunter to make money. He complained that his previous salary was only 5 million won. Chloe explained that, since he wasn't active and only participated in group missions with discounts, commissions, and taxes, he was left with only 5 million won. Park suggested that if the pay bothered him, he should climb the ranks since he was good enough. Park found the protagonist while inspecting the merchandise and was surprised. He cursed the Slayer's company, claiming that thanks to the payments for killing, he could eat well and couldn't stop doing it. He threw meat at the protagonist, who was confused, but quickly sounded the alarm, and the zombies lunged at him. Angry, the protagonist wondered why this was happening now, and explained that the zombies' most sensitive senses were hearing and smell. With his body odor hidden and proper camouflage, he was invisible to the zombies and could do his job without using his hands, regardless of his rank as a slayer. Park looked at the protagonist, who was surrounded by zombies, and wondered why he couldn't deal with so many zombies, even as an A-class slayer. Park realized that the protagonist wasn't a slayer like him, but a monster with the potential to wield a chainsaw. Park compared the protagonist to a taxi driver, thinking they were completely different. He prepared another meat alarm and mentioned that if he kept killing like that, he would get tired, and since there were too many zombies in the city, he could use them to finish off the protagonist. He threw another meat alarm and was spotted by the protagonist, who asked if he had thrown the meat. Park replied that he didn't know, and threw more meat. The protagonist was cornered by the zombies again, and told Park that he was dead, and just had to wait. Pieces of meat fell from the sky. A mass of muscle struck relentlessly, and the zombies turned into minced meat. This process repeated several times until Park ran out of traps, and the protagonist advanced further and further. Park was worried and said he only had one large disposable trap left. He retreated from the scene and exclaimed that the protagonist wasn't a person. Meanwhile, a zombie's head fell next to the protagonist. Park turned around and noticed the protagonist, who grabbed a zombie and asked where he was going. shouting that they still had unfinished business. He threw the zombie, ranked higher than a human in the food chain, while mentioning that slayers were above zombies, and whoever eliminated them was the culmination of a selfish system. The protagonist asked Park why he had to show up at that moment, and Park asked if that's how he killed the taxi driver. Park fell silent, and the protagonist told him that not only had he angered him, but he had also taken away his only means of transportation, and that his life would be the price for annoying him so much. Park asked if he had insulted him while reaching into his fanny pack. The protagonist thought he had a gun and quickly threw a shovel, impaling it in Park's shoulder, and then lunged at him. Park told him that instead of standing on his head, they would die together. Without warning, all the speakers, houses, and attractions in the amusement park turned on. Once that was done, Park told him that if a cell phone could summon dozens or hundreds of zombies, what could an amusement park do in a city with a population of 260,000? As all the zombies approached the park, someone asked who of the two was the protagonist. Park and the protagonist remained silent, and the old man asked if they were deaf. Asking again who of the two it was. The protagonist wondered what was happening to him, and how he had ended up in that place and why he was there. The park continued to make noise as the old man tried to ask again, stressing the protagonist. He took out a kind of cane and destroyed all the speakers and some spotlights. The protagonist and Park were astonished, and the old man shouted that one of them owed money to Chloe and Leon. They revealed that their name was Kim, an A-class slayer who had killed 112,700 zombies. The protagonist hesitantly raised his hand and said he believed it was him. Then they showed the conversation between Chloe, John, and Kimchi, where Kim asked Chloe if she was asking him to bring a rookie slayer. Chloe explained that she lost contact with the one who accompanied him and offered him 50 billion won to rescue him. Kim closed his briefcase and told Chloe that wasn't all, that he didn't want 50 billion won. What he asked for to save the rookie was the cure. Chloe quickly stopped him, saying that even though it was an urgent situation, she couldn't sell the cure for 300 million won. Taking a sip of tea, she asked if she could see beyond the walls, reproaching her that her new toy was outside the walls. The conditions are not being given by a desperate person. They are being given by someone with lesser concerns. She would say who, while throwing something at her, assuring her that if she gives him the cure, he would rescue him and provide guidance while also giving her 200 billion won, which he was saving. He would press her, saying he was busy, while also asking her if she would do it or not. We would go back to the old man, who would shout asking which of the two owed money to Chloe. To John, the protagonist, he would say he believed it was him, to which the old man, looking at him, would think that for someone who works little, he is in good shape. He also had just the right amount of venom in his eyes and rough skin, which showed he had been through tough times. The old man would say he was an ordinary toy, but with all the qualities. The protagonist, who thought he was being looked at like a fool, would tell him who he was, to which the old man would respond that he should think of him as his teacher. Confused, the protagonist would ask him if he wasn't going to take him to Busan. The zombies, already at the gates, would break them, making their way towards them. Prepared to leave, the protagonist would tell the old man that they had to get out of that place and would swing his cane at him, saying that he didn't let him finish. The protagonist would ask him by whose permission he could be his teacher, and the old man would respond that he was hired to teach him, while also asking why he was leaving the classroom when the lesson hadn't even finished. The protagonist, thinking that he is the type of person who doesn't want to hear what others have to say, would be interrupted by the old man, who would tell him that his first lesson was about to begin. Thus, telling him that catching a zombie is like fishing, he would ask the protagonist what he thought they had in common. The protagonist, thinking they had nothing in common, would look at the old man, who was preparing his fishing rod, and say it was a display of good taste, casting his line while explaining the need for a good grip. He would be interrupted by the protagonist, who would tell him there were zombies behind them. To the old man, it's all about being patient and only striking when necessary. He would quickly shout at the protagonist to duck. The protagonist would crouch down and see how the old man, with a swift motion and having all the zombies where he wanted them, would decapitate all the zombies along with the debris behind the protagonist. Astonished, the protagonist would ask him about the number of zombies he had eliminated. to which he would respond that he threw them about 30 meters, probably thousands of them. While the protagonist thought he was a man of few explanations, he wouldn't notice that there was a zombie behind him who would tell them that he was still alive. Confused, the protagonist would wonder if that was a zombie, thinking it was since it hit him with a shovel covered in zombie blood. But he would ask the old man the reason for its appearance, to which he would respond that it was a mutant, a type of zombie with a certain probability among the zombies, adding that since there were only racial mutations, it must be a Class C zombie. The zombie, with few memories, would curse the C rank, and then lunge at the old man, slamming him against a wall. The zombie would start saying that he hated rookies, that even a slayer like Kim Chil-sung hated him too, all while crying. He would tell the protagonist to kill him before he loses consciousness. As the protagonist raised a rod, he would say he couldn't understand. Angry, the zombie would try to strike the protagonist, who thought that being so big and fast, he didn't know if he could react in time. Quickly, and without warning, he would see the zombie's arm being cut off. Both the zombie and the protagonist would be surprised, and the old man, emerging from the debris, would say that he remembered him, that they had met once before he transformed. The old man would say that he was Park, a slayer who didn't fight zombies, calling himself a coward who only stole things while the other slayers fought. And since that wasn't enough, he started hunting slayers. The old man, calling him an irredeemable worm, would swiftly finish him off. He would tell the protagonist to remember something. Even if he is pointed at for killing a zombie that was once human, or if others call him a cold-blooded blood knight who kills for money, he doesn't have to be a true monster. He also tells him it's time to go since Chloe is waiting for him. We would then see Kimchi's past, where while fishing, he would receive a call from his daughter. He would greet her, and quickly with screams, his daughter would tell him that her husband had bitten her father-in-law. Worried, she would say she didn't know what to do. And since the police didn't even answer her calls, she was locked in a room. But her husband was trying to get in. Kimchi would tell her that he would come as soon as possible, while at the same time seeing an advertisement for a new pandemic. The old man would wake up, as it seems he was just dreaming. They would find themselves in a helicopter on the rooftop of Aqua City. When Chloe hired the old man, she told him a helicopter would arrive there in half an hour. Before leaving, the helicopter pilot would say it was an honor to meet him in person, to which the old man and the protagonist would step out of the helicopter and take the elevator. The protagonist, at that moment, would ask who the old man was and why, despite his age, he was so strong. In turn, he would tell him how he could become as strong as him. The old man would laugh and say that there were many questions, but they all had one answer. Those who have lost something and decide to reclaim it are the ones who are strong and respected, like maniacs, or in the case of homeless people. So this time, asking the protagonist, he would tell him what he has lost. The protagonist, remembering everything he had lost, would think about his parents, childhood, friends, and his brother. Before he could finish, he would be interrupted by the old man, who would tell him that he must have lost many things and ask him to think about it differently. He would ask him what connection all those things share and which one he thought of recovering first. The protagonist would say that perhaps his home, as all his good memories were in that place. But he would be interrupted by Chloe, who would tell him that he no longer had a home, as it had been taken as collateral. Confused and angry, the protagonist would ask why a little rat like her was telling him that, which would make Chloe angry in return. She would confront him, mentioning the expenses of 500 billion won for the cure, the cost of an A-class slayer, the insurance for the deceased taxi driver, the additional cost of sending a helicopter, and a lost hard drive. She would scold him for insulting her when they returned empty-handed from the fight. The protagonist would approach her, telling her that he didn't ask for the cure, and reminding her that he walked all the way to Guion on his own. He would also demand the keys to his house. Chloe would threaten him with a punch and ask if he wanted her to put a leash on him. The protagonist, about to punch her, would be stopped by the old man, warning him that if he moved, he would lose his hair, and affirming that Chloe didn't make a mistake in her calculations. Angry, the protagonist would claim that it was his house and his decision whether to become a zombie or not. The old man would ask if he didn't believe he could recover it and offer to help him find a job, property, and land, emphasizing that he was his master. After those words, the protagonist would turn around and, looking at Chloe, warn her that once he paid off his debts and reclaimed his house, he would make her pay dearly. Chloe would respond that due to being in debt, she would give the cure to the old man, but she reminded him that she wouldn't make an unfair transfer like that again. She would question if he would be able to raise the protagonist since he didn't know the world and wasn't good with emotions. She would suggest that if he couldn't, at least reach the promotion level before retiring. Chloe would ask the protagonist to bring him to the next Slayers meeting, expressing the need for him to see the world. As they left the place, the old man would say that since he had no home, he would start living with them. The protagonist, promising to soon reclaim his home, would ask what that meeting was. The old man would seriously respond that the meeting was attended by cold-blooded individuals who live off zombies in Busan, crazy people who stood out and were recognized as B-class slayers and above. This would reveal the different classes that exist, with the highest rank being Class A. In short, it's a band of crazy people.